While performing surgery on a humble woman, the surgeon was paralyzed upon seeing her birthmark, the same one his daughter had when she disappeared 18 years ago. Dr. Mitchell Lawson stood over the operating table, his hands steady as he focused on the task before him. Years of experience as a top surgeon had given him the ability to shut out distractions and dive deep into the intricacies of saving lives. But today, something was different. His mind, usually sharp and precise, faltered for a moment as he adjusted his position. The patient was Grace, a young woman brought in after a severe car accident. She had multiple injuries, including internal bleeding. It was a complicated case, but nothing Mitchell hadn't handled before. However, as he prepared to make a critical incision, something caught his eye: a small, crescent-shaped birthmark on the side of her ribcage. His breath hitched in his throat. His pulse quickened as he stared at the mark, frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was only a few seconds. He knew that mark. It was the same one his daughter, Emma, had. His daughter who had vanished 18 years ago without a trace. Dr. Lawson? The voice of the assisting nurse snapped him back to the present. Mitchell blinked, his mind racing. This wasn't possible, he thought. It couldn't be her. He shook his head slightly, forcing himself to focus on the surgery at hand. Grace needed him to be sharp, not lost in memories. Pushing the unsettling thoughts aside, he completed the surgery with the precision he was known for. But even as his hands moved with practiced ease, his mind wouldn't let go of that image. The birthmark. His heart ached as old memories flooded in. The day Emma disappeared, the endless search, the sleepless nights filled with guilt and grief. His wife had died giving birth to Emma, and he had promised to protect their daughter with everything he had. Yet, in one horrifying moment, she was gone. As the surgery concluded, Mitchell removed his gloves and stepped away from the operating room. His colleagues congratulated him on a job well done, but he barely heard them. He needed answers. Who was this young woman? Why did she have the same mark as Emma? In the recovery room, Mitchell stood by the glass window, watching Grace as she lay unconscious, her chest rising and falling steadily. She looked peaceful, unaware of the turmoil her presence had ignited in him. He couldn't help but feel a strange connection to her, something beyond the professional concern he normally had for his patients. After what felt like an eternity, Mitchell turned away, his thoughts spinning. He needed to find out more about Grace, where she came from, who her family was. But he couldn't just ask her directly, not without raising suspicion. And there was Diane to consider, his wife, the woman who had helped him pick up the pieces after Emma's disappearance. They had built a life together, though the void Emma left had never truly been filled. How could he explain to Diane that he had seen something today that made him question everything? Mitchell walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the sterile corridor. He reached his office and closed the door behind him, sinking into his chair. His hands rubbed his temples as he tried to think clearly. He couldn't let himself jump to conclusions. But that birthmark, it was too similar. It couldn't be a coincidence. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. What were the odds? How could it be her after all this time? She was only a child when she disappeared. If this woman was Emma, how had she survived? Where had she been? And why hadn't she come back to him? There was only one way to know for sure. Mitchell made a decision right there, one he knew would change everything. He would investigate. Carefully, discreetly, he would look into Grace's past. He would find out who she really was, and if, somehow, she was the daughter he had lost so many years ago. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. If it was true, if she really was Emma, it would mean facing the ghosts of the past. It would mean confronting not only his own pain, but the life he had rebuilt with Diane. Was he ready for that? Mitchell exhaled slowly, gathering his thoughts. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he had to follow it. He had to know the truth. For now, he would wait for Grace to recover. Then, he would begin his search for answers. As he left his office, the hospital around him buzzed with life, doctors and nurses moving about their day. But for Mitchell, everything had shifted. That tiny crescent-shaped mark had reopened a chapter of his life he thought was closed forever. Mitchell sat in his car, parked in the hospital lot, his hands gripping the steering wheel as memories from 18 years ago surged back with overwhelming force. The image of Grace lying on the operating table, her small, crescent-shaped birthmark visible beneath the bright surgical lights, had reignited emotions he had long tried to bury. It was impossible to see that mark and not think of Emma. He had spent years searching for his daughter. When she first went missing, Mitchell had thrown himself into the search, exhausting every resource available. He hired private investigators, contacted the police relentlessly, and put out missing persons alerts. He visited countless shelters, hospitals, and orphanages, hoping, praying, that one day she would turn up. But as the years passed, hope began to dwindle. The pain of Emma's disappearance had never left him. It was always there, like a shadow that followed him, darkening even the brightest moments of his life. When he lost his wife during childbirth, he had thought that nothing could hurt more. But losing Emma had proven him wrong. The disappearance had shattered him in ways he didn't know he could break. And through it all, Diane had been there. Diane had been a beacon of comfort in the darkest of times. They met not long after Emma disappeared, when Mitchell was at his lowest, struggling to balance his grief with his demanding career. Diane, a friend of a colleague, had stepped in with kindness and support. Her warmth and understanding had been the lifeline he needed. Slowly, they built a life together, one filled with moments of peace that dulled the sharp edges of his pain, even if it could never erase them. But now, all those feelings were coming back. The memory of Emma's laugh, her wide-eyed curiosity, the way she'd tug at his hand when she wanted to show him something new, it all rushed back like a flood. He could still hear her tiny voice calling him Daddy. Her favorite stuffed bunny tucked under her arm as she waited for him to come home from long shifts at the hospital. And then, one day, she was gone. Mitchell squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the image of that day. The panic when he realized Emma wasn't in her room, the frantic search through the house, the rising dread that turned into cold, hard fear when hours passed and there was still no sign of her. He remembered Diane arriving at the house that day, comforting him as the authorities searched every inch of the neighborhood. Diane had been a rock for him then, holding him together when he felt like he was falling apart. But now, sitting in his car, Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't quite add up. He had never questioned Diane's support back then, nor had he ever thought to connect her to Emma's disappearance in any way. Why would he? Diane had been his savior during those difficult times, a source of love and stability when everything else was crumbling. Yet now, after seeing Grace, doubts began to creep in. Was it possible that Diane had known something all along? Was it possible that she had hidden something from him? No, he thought, shaking his head. That couldn't be right. Diane had been as devastated by Emma's disappearance as he had. He couldn't let his mind wander down that dark road. Not yet. He turned the key in the ignition and drove home, trying to compose himself. As he pulled into the driveway of their house, he noticed the lights were on inside. Diane was waiting for him, just like she always did when he worked late. The familiar comfort of their home should have been soothing, but now, everything felt off balance. Mitchell wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion of the long day or the emotional storm he had just weathered, but something about coming home to Diane felt different. He stepped inside, the scent of her cooking filling the air. Diane was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared dinner. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, her expression warm and welcoming. Mitchell forced a smile in return, though his heart was still heavy with the weight of the past. "How was your day?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she approached him. "It was eventful," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. He kissed her on the cheek, but it felt mechanical, like he was going through the motions. Diane seemed to sense something was off, but she didn't press him. "You look tired. Let's sit down, and I'll bring dinner over," she said, gesturing toward the dining table. Mitchell nodded, grateful for the distraction of a meal, though his appetite had all but vanished. As they ate in relative silence, his mind kept returning to Grace, to Emma, and to that birthmark. He had to figure out what it all meant, but he couldn't talk to Diane about it. Not yet. He needed to be sure. That night, as they lay in bed, Mitchell stared at the ceiling, his thoughts restless. Diane was already asleep beside him, her breathing soft and steady. But sleep wouldn't come for him. The image of Emma, of Grace, of everything he had lost and could potentially regain, swirled in his mind. Something had shifted. The ghost of his past had come back to haunt him, and Mitchell knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, Mitchell found himself staring at the ceiling, sleep having barely touched him. His mind raced with thoughts of Grace, Emma, the birthmark, the resemblance, the timing. It was all too much to be a coincidence. But what if he was wrong? What if this was just wishful thinking, his heart clinging to the possibility that Emma was still out there, alive? Mitchell got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Diane, who was still sound asleep beside him. He moved through the house on autopilot, his thoughts miles away as he made a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, staring blankly out the window. He needed to do something. He couldn't just sit here and wait for answers to fall into his lap. The thought of going to Grace directly crossed his mind, but he quickly dismissed it. He had to be careful. He didn't want to scare her or make her feel uncomfortable. What would he even say? "Hi, I'm Dr. Mitchell Lawson, and I think you might be my long-lost daughter." No, that wouldn't work. He needed a plan. After finishing his coffee, Mitchell got dressed and headed to the hospital earlier than usual. He wasn't scheduled to work, but he had a reason for going in today. He wanted to find out more about Grace, to learn where she had come from and if there was any connection to Emma's disappearance. His pulse quickened at the thought. At the hospital, Mitchell made his way to the records department. He needed access to Grace's file, but he had to be discreet. He didn't want to raise any suspicions or have anyone question why he was looking into her past. Fortunately, his position as a senior surgeon gave him the access he needed without too many questions. He pulled Grace's file and took it back to his office, closing the door behind him. He flipped through the pages, searching for any details that might point to who Grace really was. The file was sparse, as expected. She had been found abandoned as a child, taken in by a foster family who had cared for her since she was about 3 years old. There were no records of her birth parents, no information about where she had come from. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere, with no past to speak of. Mitchell's heart raced as he read through the documents. Could it be that Grace had been taken from him and ended up in the foster care system, with no one knowing her true identity? The timeline fit. Grace was the right age. But still, there were gaps. He needed more. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he tried to piece everything together. The birthmark, the timing, the fact that she had no memory of her early years. It all pointed to one thing. But without solid proof, he couldn't be sure. He needed to go deeper. Just as he was lost in thought, a knock on the door startled him. He quickly closed the file and looked up as Diane walked in, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "You're in early, Dawn," she said, smiling as she walked over to him. "I thought you had the morning off." "I did," Mitchell replied, trying to sound casual. "I just had some paperwork to catch up on." Diane glanced around the room, her eyes lingering for a moment on the file he had just hidden. Mitchell's heart skipped a beat, but he forced a smile, trying to act as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone light but probing. "Yeah, just busy," Mitchell said, standing up from his desk. "I've been thinking a lot about work, trying to stay focused." Diane nodded, though her eyes still held a flicker of suspicion. "Well, don't push yourself too hard. You've been through a lot. We both have." Her words hung in the air, a reminder of the shared pain they carried from Emma's disappearance. For a moment, Mitchell felt a pang of guilt. Diane had always been there for him, through the worst of it. He didn't want to hurt her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than he realized. "I know," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm just trying to make sense of everything." Diane smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I understand. Just don't lose yourself in it. Okay?" Mitchell nodded, watching as Diane left his office. As soon as the door closed behind her, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He needed to be more careful. Diane was starting to sense that something was off, and he couldn't afford to tip her off just yet. Not until he knew for sure. After she left, Mitchell returned to the file, but he knew it wouldn't give him the answers he was looking for. If he was going to find out the truth about Grace, he needed help from someone with experience in these kinds of investigations. That afternoon, Mitchell made a call to an old acquaintance, a private investigator he had worked with years ago when Emma first disappeared. If anyone could dig deeper into Grace's past and find the missing pieces, it would be him. Mitchell wasn't ready to fully confront Grace, or Diane, just yet. But he knew he had to keep searching. The truth, whatever it was, couldn't stay hidden forever. Over the following days, Mitchell's routine shifted. He still performed his duties at the hospital with his usual precision, but his mind was always somewhere else, constantly drawn back to Grace. He found himself visiting her room more often than necessary, checking in on her recovery. Each time he stood by her bedside, watching her slowly regain strength, he couldn't help but feel a powerful pull toward her. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was something deeper, something paternal. Grace, unaware of the emotional storm swirling around her doctor, was recovering well. Her injuries had been severe, but her body was strong, and she was determined to get back on her feet. She was a fighter. Mitchell could see that. It was one of the many things that reminded him of Emma. The resilience, the quiet determination, the way she held herself even when in pain, it all tugged at his heart. One afternoon, after finishing his rounds, Mitchell walked into Grace's room. She was sitting up in bed, flipping through a magazine. She looked up as he entered, a faint smile on her lips. "Dr. Lawson," she greeted him, her voice still a bit weak but steady. "I was wondering when you'd come by." Mitchell smiled in return, trying to keep his emotions in check. "How are you feeling today, Grace?" "Better," she replied, setting the magazine down. "Still sore, but I can tell I'm healing." "Good," Mitchell said, glancing at her chart. "You're making great progress." There was a pause, and Grace looked at him with a curious expression. "You've been checking on me a lot, haven't you?" Mitchell's heart skipped a beat. Had she noticed? He kept his tone light, shrugging. "Just doing my job. I like to make sure my patients are well taken care of." Grace nodded, though something in her gaze suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "I appreciate it," she said quietly. "I don't have many people looking out for me." That statement hit Mitchell harder than he expected. His chest tightened as he thought about how different things could have been if Emma had grown up with him. He had spent so many years imagining what their life together would have been like, how he would have protected her, cared for her, and supported her through every challenge. And now, here was Grace, a woman who could very well be the daughter he had lost, saying she didn't have anyone looking out for her. "Well, you have people now," Mitchell said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "You're not alone." Grace looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled again, but this time it reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." Mitchell nodded, feeling a surge of emotion he had to work hard to suppress. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain why he felt such a strong connection to her, but he knew it wasn't the right time. Not yet. He needed to wait for the private investigator to finish his work. Only then would he know if Grace was truly Emma. Over the next few days, Mitchell continued to visit Grace regularly, their conversations becoming longer and more personal. She told him bits and pieces about her life, how she had grown up in foster care, raised by a family who loved her but couldn't afford to search for her biological parents. She had always known she was adopted, but she didn't have any memories of her life before the age of 3. Her foster parents had done their best to give her a happy childhood, but Grace admitted that she had always felt a sense of loss, an emptiness that she couldn't quite explain. As Mitchell listened to her, his heart ached. The more she spoke, the more certain he became that she was Emma. It all fit: the timeline, the circumstances, the birthmark. But he still needed proof. One afternoon, as Grace was telling him about her dreams of going back to school once she recovered, Mitchell's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from the private investigator. "Got something. Let's meet." Mitchell's pulse quickened. This was it. The answers he had been waiting for. He stood up, trying to hide the sudden rush of anticipation. "I'm glad to hear you're planning to go back to school," he said, smiling at Grace. "I'll check in on you later, okay?" Grace nodded, though her brow furrowed slightly. "Thanks, Dr. Lawson." Mitchell hurried out of the room, his heart racing. He needed to know what the investigator had found. The drive to the meeting point felt like an eternity, his mind spinning with possibilities. When he arrived at the small cafe where they had agreed to meet, the investigator was already waiting. "You found something?" Mitchell asked as soon as he sat down. The man nodded, sliding a folder across the table. "You're not going to believe this," he said. Mitchell opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. His breath caught in his throat as he saw the words on the page, information about a missing child case that matched Emma's description. The child had been found and placed in the foster system, but the records had been sealed for years due to a clerical error. "It's her," the investigator said, confirming what Mitchell had already begun to realize. "Grace is Emma." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. It was real. Grace was his daughter. Emma had been alive all this time, living a life he knew nothing about. And now, after 18 long years, they were on the brink of being reunited. But with that revelation came the overwhelming question: what now? Mitchell sat in his car outside the cafe, staring blankly at the folder on the passenger seat. The evidence was all there, neatly compiled by the private investigator. Grace was Emma, his Emma. After all these years, after all the sleepless nights and endless prayers, he had finally found her. But the joy he should have felt was overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. What now? How could he tell Grace the truth without overwhelming her? And what about Diane? He couldn't ignore the fact that Grace had no memory of her life before she was found. She had spent her entire life believing she was someone else, someone with no connection to him or her past. Dropping a bombshell like this could turn her world upside down, and Mitchell wasn't sure if he was ready to deal with the fallout. Mitchell took a deep breath and started the engine, heading back toward the hospital. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as his thoughts raced. He couldn't just sit on this information forever. Grace deserved to know the truth, but how could he tell her without scaring her away? And what if after learning the truth, she wanted nothing to do with him? As he pulled into the hospital parking lot, Mitchell's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. Another message from Diane. "Are you coming home soon? Dinner at 7?" He sighed, the weight of the secret he was carrying pressing down on him. Diane had been patient with him over the past few days, though he knew she could sense something was off. He hadn't told her anything about Grace, about the birthmark or the investigation. How could he? Diane had stood by him through the worst of his grief, helping him rebuild his life after Emma's disappearance. But now, everything was about to change. Mitchell stepped out of the car, his legs feeling heavy as he made his way back into the hospital. He needed more time. Time to figure out how to tell Grace, how to tell Diane, how to make sense of the flood of emotions crashing over him. He made his way down the hallway to his office, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He sank into his chair, his mind racing. Could he really confront Diane? The thought sent a chill down his spine. He loved her, but a part of him had always felt like something was missing. Now, with Grace, Emma, back in his life, that emptiness felt more pronounced than ever. Just as he was about to lose himself in thought again, a soft knock on the door interrupted him. The door creaked open slightly, and to his surprise, Diane stepped in, her expression warm but tinged with concern. "You're here late again," she said, closing the door behind her. "I was hoping you'd be home earlier tonight." Mitchell straightened in his chair, trying to appear composed. "Yeah, sorry about that. It's been a long day." Diane walked over to him, her eyes searching his face. "You've been distracted lately. Is everything okay?" Mitchell swallowed hard, feeling the familiar tension tighten around his chest. He had to tell her something. Maybe not the whole truth, but enough to keep her from worrying. "It's just work," he lied, forcing a smile. "I've had a lot on my mind." Diane didn't seem convinced. She sat down across from him, her brow furrowed. "Mitchell, I know when something's bothering you. You don't have to hide it from me." For a moment, Mitchell considered telling her everything right then and there, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Not until he had a clearer idea of what the next steps would be. So instead, he nodded and reached for her hand. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm just trying to sort through some things. I'll be okay." Diane squeezed his hand gently, her gaze softening. "You don't have to do it alone, you know. I'm here. I always have been." Mitchell nodded again, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He knew she meant well, but the secret he was holding felt like a barrier between them. How could he confide in her when everything was about to change? After a few moments of silence, Diane stood up, offering him a smile. "Don't stay too late, okay? I'll see you at home." As she left the office, Mitchell let out a long breath. He watched the door close behind her and leaned back in his chair, his mind buzzing with everything he still needed to figure out. He had a daughter, alive and well, but she didn't know him, and soon he'd have to tell Diane the truth about Grace, about Emma. That evening, as Mitchell drove home, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Diane. It was a message from the private investigator. "I've dug deeper into Grace's background. There's something else you need to know." Mitchell's pulse quickened as he read the message. What else could there be? Had the investigator uncovered more about Grace's past? He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had thought he was prepared for whatever truth might come to light, but now he wasn't so sure. He typed a quick response, agreeing to meet the investigator again the next day. The answers he sought were just within reach, but with every new piece of the puzzle, the complexity of the situation seemed to grow. He had found his daughter, but the deeper he dug, the more he feared the truth might be more than he could handle. Mitchell pulled into the driveway of his home, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow, he would meet with the investigator again. Tomorrow, he might get the answers that could change everything once more. But tonight, as he stepped inside to join Diane for dinner, he couldn't shake the feeling that the calm before the storm was almost over. Mitchell sat in the cafe once again, his heart pounding as he waited for the private investigator to arrive. His coffee sat untouched in front of him, the steam slowly dissipating into the cool air. The investigator's message from the night before had rattled him, leaving him on edge. He wasn't sure what to expect, but something about the tone of the message made his stomach twist with apprehension. Finally, the door to the cafe swung open, and the investigator stepped inside. He was an older man, his face lined with years of experience in uncovering the most painful truths. Mitchell's pulse quickened as the man made his way over, his expression unreadable. "Morning," the investigator said as he sat down, sliding a folder across the table just like he had before. "You're not going to like this." Mitchell's throat tightened. "What is it?" The investigator took a deep breath, leaning forward slightly. "I dug deeper into Grace's past like you asked. The foster system didn't have much on her early years, but I managed to find something that wasn't in the official reports." He paused, glancing at the folder. It seems that when Grace was first found, there was a lot of confusion about her identity. She was placed in foster care under the assumption that she had no living relatives. But there's more. Mitchell's hand hovered over the folder, his heart pounding in his ears. "What do you mean?" The investigator folded his hands on the table. Grace wasn't just abandoned. There are records, sealed ones, that suggest she was deliberately hidden. The people who found her didn't just stumble upon her. They were part of a much larger scheme. Someone wanted her to disappear, to never be found. Mitchell felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Who?" His voice was barely a whisper. The investigator's eyes locked onto his. "Now that's the part you're not going to like. I can't say for certain, but all signs point to someone close to you. The records show inconsistencies that suggest this wasn't a random kidnapping. It looks like someone orchestrated it." Mitchell's mind raced, his thoughts swirling in confusion and disbelief. Someone close to him. Who could have done such a thing? Who would want to take Emma from him? He swallowed hard, his mind jumping to the most obvious answer. Diane. Could it be her? No, it couldn't be. She had been with him through it all. She had supported him, loved him. The idea that she could be involved in something so horrific was unthinkable. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and it was growing fast. Mitchell stared down at the folder, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside were more documents, photographs, reports, and a timeline of Grace's life before she was placed in foster care. The more he read, the more his heart sank. The evidence was overwhelming. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that Grace, Emma, was hidden, and that person had to be someone with access to both his life and his trust. The investigator spoke again, his voice low. "Mitchell, I don't have concrete proof, but the timeline matches up with the time you and Diane met. There are gaps in her story that align with the events around Grace's disappearance." Mitchell's mind was reeling. He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, feeling as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. Could Diane really be involved? The woman he had trusted with his life? The one who had been there through every moment of grief and pain? Could she have been the one to take Emma from him? I need time to process this," Mitchell stammered, his voice shaking. The investigator nodded. "Take your time, but remember, if this is true, you need to confront it head on. Grace deserves to know the truth." Mitchell barely heard the words. His mind was too clouded with the possibility that his entire life had been built on a lie. He thanked the investigator in a daze and left the cafe, walking to his car in a fog. As he sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, his thoughts spiraled. Diane had always been there for him. She had been his rock, his comfort. She had helped him heal after Emma disappeared. How could she possibly be involved? But the evidence, Mitchell couldn't ignore it. The pieces were starting to come together in ways that made his stomach churn. When he finally returned to the hospital, it was well past noon. He had no intention of going home to Diane, not yet. Not until he had a clearer understanding of what to do next. Instead, he went straight to Grace's room. He needed to see her, to remind himself why he was doing all of this. Grace was sitting up in bed, a small smile on her face when she saw him. "Dr. Lawson," she greeted him. "You're back." Mitchell forced a smile, though his mind was still racing. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Grace said, her eyes bright. "I think I might be ready to leave soon." Mitchell nodded, trying to keep his composure. "That's good news." There was a pause as Grace studied him, her expression growing more serious. "You seem off. Is everything okay?" Mitchell hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. Could he really tell her? Could he reveal everything he had learned in the last few days? Grace, Emma, deserved the truth. But how could he burden her with the weight of such a revelation when he didn't even know how to handle it himself? "I'm fine," he lied, his voice quiet. "Just a lot on my mind." Grace didn't press him further, but the look in her eyes told him she knew something was wrong. Mitchell sat with her for a while longer, talking about her recovery, but his mind was elsewhere. As he left the room, his heart felt heavier than ever. The truth was coming for him, faster than he could outrun it, and soon he would have to face it, no matter how much it hurt. The house felt eerily quiet as Mitchell stepped inside later that evening. The familiar warmth that usually greeted him seemed absent, replaced by a heavy tension he couldn't shake. His mind was racing with the possibility of what the investigator had uncovered, his stomach churning as he tried to process the gravity of it all. Could Diane have really been involved in Emma's disappearance? Could the woman he had shared his life with for so many years have been hiding something so monstrous? He closed the door softly behind him, setting his keys down on the entryway table. The sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen told him that Diane was busy preparing dinner, just as she always did. But tonight, everything felt different. Every small detail, every mundane sound, seemed to carry a weight that pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Mitchell stood there for a long moment, his mind torn between confronting her and retreating to the safety of silence. But he couldn't keep quiet any longer. He had to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. With a deep breath, he made his way into the kitchen. Diane was at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. She looked up when he entered, offering him a smile that, under any other circumstances, would have put him at ease. But not tonight. Tonight, all he could see was the possibility of betrayal behind her familiar, comforting face. "You're home a little late," Diane said, her tone light as she turned off the stove. "Dinner's almost ready." Mitchell didn't respond right away. He stood there, watching her, trying to reconcile the woman he loved with the growing suspicion that gnawed at him. How could he have missed the signs? Or had there never been any? Had Diane been so good at hiding the truth that he had never questioned her? He swallowed hard, his voice finally breaking the silence. "Diane, we need to talk." Diane turned, her smile faltering as she noticed the seriousness in his tone. She set the spoon down on the counter, her brow furrowing in concern. "What's wrong? Did something happen at the hospital?" Mitchell shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt like he was on the edge of a precipice, about to step into the unknown. "No, it's not the hospital," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "It's about Emma." Diane's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something crossing her face before she quickly masked it with confusion. "Emma? Why are you bringing her up now?" Mitchell took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because I know the truth, Diane. I know what happened to her." For a moment, there was silence. The kitchen, once filled with the soothing hum of cooking, now felt cold and still. Diane stared at him, her eyes wide, her breath catching in her throat. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice unsteady. But Mitchell could see the cracks forming in her facade. He had spent years knowing this woman, loving her, trusting her. And now, as she stood in front of him, he could see the fear, the guilt, bubbling just beneath the surface. "Stop lying to me," he said, his voice rising despite his effort to stay calm. "I know you were involved in Emma's disappearance. I know you had something to do with her being taken from me." Diane took a step back, her eyes wide with shock. "Mitchell, what are you talking about? How can you even say something like that?" "Because I've been investigating, Diane," Mitchell pressed, his heart pounding in his chest. "I hired a private investigator. He found the records, the evidence. Grace. She's Emma. Our Emma. And you knew, didn't you?" Diane's face went pale, her hands trembling as she leaned against the counter for support. For a long moment, she said nothing. The weight of the accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Diane spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did it for us." Mitchell's stomach dropped. The air seemed to leave the room all at once, and his world tilted on its axis. He had expected denial, maybe even outrage. But not this. Not an admission of guilt. "You did what?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Diane's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, her voice shaking. "I couldn't lose you, Mitchell. After Emma was born, after everything we went through, I knew how much you loved her. I knew that I could never compete with that. You would always put her first. And I—" She broke off, her hands covering her face as sobs racked her body. Mitchell stood there, frozen, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in his mind. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had built a life with, had stolen his daughter out of jealousy. She had orchestrated the entire thing, taking Emma from him because she wanted him all to herself. "How could you do this?" Mitchell whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of his grief. "How could you take my daughter from me?" Diane sobbed harder, sinking to the floor as the guilt she had carried for years finally broke through the surface. "I'm sorry," she choked out. I thought it would bring us closer. I never meant for it to go this far. But once it started, I couldn't stop it." Mitchell's hands shook as he watched her, his heart shattered into pieces. "You destroyed everything," he said, his voice barely audible. "You took her from me, from us. You lied to me for all these years." Diane looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "Please, Mitchell, I never wanted this. I love you. I thought I was doing the right thing. Please." But Mitchell couldn't listen to her anymore. The betrayal was too deep, the pain too raw. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Diane sobbing on the floor. He needed to get out of there. He needed to breathe. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, Mitchell felt like he was drowning. The truth had finally come out, and it had torn his life apart. Mitchell drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, his mind a blur of emotions: anger, betrayal, disbelief. Each feeling crashed over him like waves, pulling him deeper into an ocean of confusion and hurt. He couldn't escape the image of Diane sobbing on the floor, confessing the unimaginable. The woman he had trusted, the woman who had stood by his side through the darkest times, had orchestrated the disappearance of his daughter, his hands clenched around the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. How could she have done this? How could she live with that secret for so long, watching him grieve, watching him search for Emma, all the while knowing she had been the one to take her away? Mitchell pulled over to the side of the road, turning off the engine. He sat there in silence, the weight of Diane's confession pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He had spent years mourning the loss of Emma, years trying to move forward, to rebuild his life. And now, everything he thought he knew had been shattered. Grace, Emma, had been right there, living a life he never knew about, a life stolen from him by the very person he had trusted most. Mitchell leaned his head against the steering wheel, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. What was he supposed to do now? He had finally found Emma, but at what cost? Could he really confront her with the truth? Could he tell her that her disappearance had been orchestrated by Diane, the woman who had been a second mother to her? He sat there for what felt like hours, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them offering any clear solution. Every path he considered led to more pain, more betrayal. How was he supposed to explain all of this to Grace? And even if he could, would she ever forgive him for the life she had lost? Finally, as the first rays of dawn broke through the horizon, Mitchell made a decision. He couldn't keep this from Grace any longer. She deserved to know the truth. She deserved to know who she really was and what had been taken from her. And as much as it terrified him, as much as he wanted to protect her from the pain, he knew he couldn't hide the truth forever. Mitchell started the car again and drove back toward the hospital, his mind made up. He would talk to Grace. He would tell her everything. But he wasn't sure how she would react, whether she would be relieved to finally know the truth or devastated by the knowledge of what had been done to her. When he arrived at the hospital, it was still early. The halls were quiet, only a few nurses moving about as the day began. Mitchell made his way to Grace's room, his heart pounding in his chest. He paused outside the door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Grace was sitting up in bed, flipping through a book. She looked up when she saw him, a smile spreading across her face. "Dr. Lawson, you're here early." Mitchell forced a smile, though his heart felt heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. "Yeah," he said quietly, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "I needed to talk to you." Grace's smile faded slightly, concern flickering in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" Mitchell hesitated, his mind racing with how to even begin. How do you tell someone that their entire life has been a lie? How do you explain that the people they trusted have betrayed them in the most unimaginable way? "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice unsteady. "Something important about your past." Grace frowned, setting the book aside. "My past?" Mitchell nodded, his throat tightening. "Grace, you were adopted. I know you already know that. But there's more to the story. There's something you need to know about where you came from." Grace's eyes widened slightly, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Mitchell took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "Your real name isn't Grace. It's Emma. You're my daughter." The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Grace stared at him, her mouth slightly open, as if trying to process what he had just said. "Your daughter?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mitchell nodded, his heart breaking at the confusion and fear he saw in her eyes. 18 years ago, you disappeared. You were taken from me. I've been searching for you ever since." Grace shook her head, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the blanket. "No, that can't be right. I don't remember any of that." "I know," Mitchell said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You were so young when it happened. You wouldn't remember. But it's true. I've had tests done. I've looked into your past, and everything points to one thing. You're Emma." Tears filled Grace's eyes as she stared at him, her mind reeling. Why didn't I know? Why didn't anyone tell me?" Mitchell swallowed hard, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. "Because someone wanted to keep it from you. Someone close to me. My wife, Diane. She's the one who took you." Grace's face went pale, her breath catching in her throat. "Diane? The woman you're married to?" Mitchell nodded, his heart breaking at the pain he saw in her eyes. "She did it because she was jealous. She thought if you were gone, I would focus on her. She thought it was the only way." Grace shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, that can't be true. That can't be." "I'm so sorry," Mitchell whispered, his own voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything you've lost, for everything she's done. But I promise you, I'll make it right. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Grace stared at him, her whole world crashing down around her. The life she had known, the people she had trusted, all of it had been built on a lie. And now, as she sat there, tears streaming down her face, she wasn't sure if she would ever be able to piece it all back together again. Grace sat in stunned silence, her entire world tilting in a way she had never imagined. The room around her seemed to blur, the walls closing in as Mitchell's words echoed in her mind. She wasn't Grace. She wasn't the person she had believed herself to be for her entire life. She was Emma, a child stolen from her father, a life taken from her without any warning, any explanation. And the woman who had raised her, Diane, the person who had taken her away from everything she should have known, Tears streamed down her face, hot and unrelenting, as she struggled to wrap her mind around the revelation. It was too much. It felt impossible, but the pain in Mitchell's voice, the raw emotion in his eyes, it was undeniable. He was telling the truth. "Why didn't anyone look for me?" "Grace," Emma finally whispered, her voice trembling. She looked up at Mitchell, her heart breaking under the weight of the unanswered questions. "Why didn't I ever know?" Mitchell reached out, his hand hovering just above hers, unsure if she would let him comfort her. "I did look for you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I searched everywhere for years. But Diane, she made sure you were hidden. She did everything in her power to keep you from me." Emma shook her head, her body trembling as the reality of it all settled in. "But why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why would she do this to us?" Mitchell's eyes filled with tears as he looked at his daughter, the pain in his chest almost unbearable. "Because she was afraid," he said quietly. "She was afraid that if you were still in my life, I wouldn't be able to love her the way she wanted. She thought if she took you away, we could be happy. But she was wrong. I was never whole without you." Emma felt a sob rise in her throat, but she swallowed it back, trying to hold herself together. Her hands clenched the blanket tightly, as if holding on to something physical could keep her grounded in this new reality. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're my daughter," Mitchell said, his voice soft but steady. "You're Emma. You're the girl I've loved and missed every single day for the last 18 years. That hasn't changed." Emma looked at him, her eyes swimming with tears. "But everything's changed," she whispered. "My whole life. It's all been a lie." Mitchell's heart broke for her, and he wished more than anything that he could take away her pain, that he could go back in time and undo everything Diane had done. But he couldn't. All he could do now was be there for her, help her navigate this new, painful reality. "I know it feels like that right now," Mitchell said gently, "but we'll figure this out together. We'll take it one step at a time. You're not alone in this, Emma. You have me." Emma wiped at her tears, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her emotions. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel comforted by the fact that her real father was here, offering her love and support. But she couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of loss, the years that had been stolen from her. She had lived her entire life not knowing the truth. And now that it was finally out, she didn't know how to move forward. "I don't even know what to feel right now," Emma said, her voice shaky. "I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm confused. I don't know how to process any of this." "That's okay," Mitchell said softly. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. I don't expect you to. Just know that I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." Emma looked at him, the man who had unknowingly been her father all this time, and felt a surge of emotions she couldn't name. There was a part of her that wanted to embrace him, to accept the love he was offering. But there was another part of her that felt distant, disconnected from the man who, though biologically her father, was still a stranger to her in many ways. "I need time," Emma said finally, her voice small. Mitchell nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going to push you. I just want you to know that I'm here when you're ready." They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. Emma wiped at her eyes again, trying to pull herself together. She glanced at the clock on the wall, realizing that hours had passed since the conversation had begun, and yet it felt like time had stood still. Mitchell stood up, sensing that she needed space. "I should probably let you rest," he said quietly. "But if you need anything at all, just call me. I'll be here." Emma nodded, her eyes still puffy from crying. "Okay." Mitchell hesitated for a moment, wanting to say something more, but unsure of what. Finally, he simply whispered, "I love you, Emma," before turning and walking out of the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. As the door closed softly behind him, Emma sat back against the pillows, her mind spinning. She had never felt so lost, so uncertain about who she was or where she belonged. Everything she had known had been ripped away from her in the span of a few hours, and now she was left to pick up the pieces. But as overwhelming as it all was, there was a small part of her, deep down, that felt something new. A small flicker of hope. The father she had lost was here, and even though everything else felt broken, maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal together. Mitchell left the hospital with his heart heavy, the conversation with Emma replaying over and over in his mind. He had finally told her the truth, and while he had expected her to feel overwhelmed, seeing her reaction had been harder than he could have imagined. The look of confusion, pain, and loss on her face haunted him as he drove home. He had spent years hoping and praying for this day, finally finding his daughter. But now that it had happened, it felt as though they had both lost something even more. Pulling into the driveway, Mitchell sat in the car for a few moments, gathering his thoughts. He wasn't ready to face Diane. He wasn't ready to confront the woman who had destroyed their lives. Yet, he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. Diane had taken Emma from him, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. As he stepped inside, the house was quiet. The lights were dimmed, and there was no sign of Diane. A part of him was relieved. He needed time to think. But another part of him was itching for a confrontation, the anger he had tried to suppress bubbling to the surface. Mitchell made his way to the living room, his hands trembling slightly as he sat down on the couch. His mind raced with questions. What had driven Diane to do such a thing? Had she ever regretted it? And more importantly, what was he supposed to do now? How could he move forward with her in his life, knowing the truth about what she had done? He hadn't been sitting for long when he heard soft footsteps approaching. Diane appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. She must have sensed that the truth was out because there was no pretense, no forced smile. Instead, her eyes were filled with fear. "Mitchell," she said quietly, her voice shaky. "Can we talk?" Mitchell looked up at her, the anger he had tried to push down rising to the surface. "Talk," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything you've done, you want to talk." Diane flinched at the sharpness in his tone, but she didn't back down. "Please," she whispered, taking a tentative step toward him. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you, hurt Emma, but I need you to understand that I never meant for it to go this far." Mitchell stood up abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. "You never meant for it to go this far. Diane, you took my daughter from me. You stole her away because you were jealous, and now you want me to understand." Tears filled Diane's eyes, and she reached out toward him, but Mitchell stepped back, his hands clenched into fists. "I was scared," Diane sobbed. "I was scared that you would never love me the way you loved her. I was so desperate to make our life work. I thought if she was gone, we could finally be happy." "Happy?" Mitchell's voice cracked with disbelief. "You thought I could be happy without my daughter? Do you know what you've done to us? To me? To Emma?" Diane's sobs grew louder, her body trembling as she sank to the floor, her face buried in her hands. "I know I've ruined everything," she cried. "I know you'll never forgive me. But please, Mitchell, I didn't want to lose you. I love you." Mitchell stared down at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a heavy stone. The love she claimed to have for him felt hollow now, tainted by the horrible truth of what she had done. He wanted to feel something: anger, hatred, even pity. But all he felt was emptiness. "Love," he whispered, his voice cold. "You don't know what love is. If you loved me, you wouldn't have taken my daughter away. You wouldn't have let me suffer all these years, believing she was gone forever." Diane looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "I can't take it back," she whispered. "I know that. But I'm begging you. Please don't leave me. I'll do anything to make it right." Mitchell's heart ached with a mix of emotions he couldn't name. He had shared a life with this woman, built a family with her. At least, that's what he had thought. But now that family was shattered, and there was no way to put it back together. "I can't do this anymore, Diane," Mitchell said quietly, his voice filled with resignation. "I don't know who you are. I don't know how you could do something so terrible and live with it for all these years." Diane's sobs grew louder as she realized the weight of his words. "Please," she begged, crawling toward him. "I'll get help. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't leave me." But Mitchell knew it was over. The woman he had once loved was a stranger to him now, her betrayal too deep to forgive. He shook his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. "It's too late," he said softly. "You've taken everything from me." Diane's sobs echoed through the house as Mitchell turned and walked toward the door. He couldn't stay here any longer. Not with the memories of what they had lost, of what had been stolen from them. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit him like a wave, and he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to find a way to move forward, for Emma's sake. She was the one who had suffered the most, and now, more than ever, she needed him. As Mitchell walked down the driveway, his thoughts turned to Emma. He had to help her heal, to guide her through the pain of what they had both lost. And though the road ahead would be difficult, he knew they could face it together. The days that followed felt like a blur for Mitchell. His world had been turned upside down, but in the quiet aftermath of his confrontation with Diane, he found himself focused on one thing: Emma. Despite the turmoil, despite the pain that Diane's betrayal had caused, Mitchell knew that his future rested on rebuilding his relationship with his daughter. It was the only way forward. He spent hours at the hospital, sitting by Emma's bedside, talking to her, trying to bridge the 18-year gap that had separated them. It wasn't easy. There were moments of awkwardness, moments where neither of them knew what to say. But slowly, they began to find common ground. They talked about little things at first: her favorite books, his work at the hospital, the memories he had of her as a child. The conversations were tentative, but with each passing day, they grew more comfortable with each other. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the window of her hospital room, Emma looked at Mitchell with a mixture of sadness and hope in her eyes. "Do you think we'll ever really know each other?" she asked softly, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. Mitchell's heart ached at the question. He had asked himself the same thing countless times over the past few days. 18 years was a long time, and the life they had lost couldn't be regained. But as he looked into her eyes, he knew that he was willing to spend the rest of his life trying. "We've missed a lot," Mitchell admitted, his voice gentle. "But we have time now, Emma, and we'll figure it out together." Emma looked down at her hands, silent for a moment before she finally nodded. "I hope so," she whispered. "It's just hard, you know? I feel like I've lost so much." Mitchell reached out, placing his hand over hers. "I know, and I'm so sorry for everything that was taken from you. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Emma looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to believe that," she said quietly. "I do, but it's hard to trust again after everything." Mitchell nodded, understanding the depth of her pain. "You don't have to trust me right away," he said. "Take your time. We'll go at your pace. Just know that I'm here for you, always." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the past hanging between them. But in that silence, there was also something new, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. The next few days passed slowly but steadily. Emma was discharged from the hospital, and Mitchell offered her a place to stay at his home, though he knew it would be an adjustment for both of them. She had her own life, her own independence, and Mitchell didn't want to push too hard. But Emma accepted his offer, and together, they began the delicate process of navigating this new chapter of their lives. Their first few days living together were awkward. Mitchell wasn't sure how to act, whether to treat her like the adult she had become or the child he had lost. Emma, too, seemed unsure, caught between wanting to build a relationship with her father and still processing the trauma of her past. But despite the awkwardness, there were moments of connection, small, fleeting moments that gave Mitchell hope. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the television playing softly in the background, Emma turned to him suddenly. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if none of this had happened?" she asked, her voice soft. Mitchell sighed, leaning back in his chair. "All the time," he admitted. "I've thought about it every day for the last 18 years. I used to imagine what you'd be like, how you'd grow up, what kind of person you'd become. And now, seeing you here, knowing you're Emma, it's hard to wrap my head around." Emma nodded, her eyes distant. "I wonder sometimes if I would have turned out different, you know? If I hadn't been taken, if I had grown up with you instead of—" She trailed off, and Mitchell's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. "I think about that too," he said quietly. "But we can't change the past. All we can do now is focus on what we have going forward." Emma looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I guess you're right." There was a pause, and then Emma added, "I'm scared, though. I'm scared that I'll never really feel normal again, that this will always be hanging over me." Mitchell's chest tightened, but he reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "You don't have to be okay right away," he said. "This is a lot to process, and it's going to take time. But we'll get through it, together." Emma looked at him for a long moment, and then, slowly, she nodded. "I want that," she said softly. "I want to believe we can." In the days that followed, Mitchell saw small changes in Emma. She began to open up more, sharing stories from her childhood, her experiences in foster care, and her dreams for the future. Mitchell listened, his heart swelling with pride and love for the woman she had become, even under the most difficult circumstances. As they spent more time together, Mitchell felt the weight of the past slowly begin to lift. The pain of what had happened would never fully go away, but he and Emma were finding a way to move forward, to build something new out of the wreckage of their old lives. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emma turned to him with a small smile. "You know," she said quietly, "I think we're going to be okay." Mitchell smiled back at her, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. "Yeah," he said softly, "I think we are." And for the first time in a long time, Mitchell believed it.